Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Chris Rossini, the co-host. And Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good morning. And today I'd like to talk a little bit about Trump and all his energy being put into imposing tariffs, taxes on the American people. So there's a lot of fallacies associated with trade policy. I thought a few years ago that just about everybody agreed that protectionism was bad. And they sort of believed it because they created a WTO, which was managed trade, and they do a lot of double talk. But it's always been around before. But outright trade wars, generally, most economists would argue against them. But now here we have an administration that's very, very positive on trade wars. But I think they have a lot of misinformation they're dealing with. Because what was Trump's statement? Trade wars are good. So it's easy to win a trade war. So I think that you and I would share our concern about the direction that our administration is going in this trade policy.
Yes, this is, I'll tell you, rarely am I surprised when I hear politicians, but when I was reading Trump's tweets this morning, I had to say wow to myself because I couldn't believe it. But this is yet another special interest ripoff of the American taxpayer, and they all have to have their pitches. And on this show especially, we cover the military-industrial complex, and they have a carousel of foreign boogeymen to just keep the money going to them and the power going to them. And Wall Street does it too. They have their pitches on if you don't bail them out, then the economic world will end. And the green industry, the earth will turn into a fireball or an ice cube, depending on the day, if you don't give them more power and more money. And this week we see that the steel and aluminum, it's to beat China. So we're going to have to pay higher prices and be taxed by our government for another special interest group.
And one of Trump's arguments is that we have to do it for national security reasons. When they run out of arguments, or their arguments are weak, national security, then you can justify anything you want. But his argument is, and this has been used in the past, is we have to do it. We have to be able to make our steel, and we have to have our aluminum for national security reasons and keep the war machine going. So he was building this big military operation. At the same time, he's worrying about the trade and the cost, but he doesn't realize it, but it makes it cost a lot more. Now, the interesting thing about these tariffs will be that everybody knows that the direction and the punishment is at China. China is the bad guy, and we have to punish them. And yet what we're doing is putting a tax on the American people. But if you look at our imports, yes, we import a lot of steel because it's a better deal for us. And that's the way the market works. You go where the best deal is, and people get to pick and choose. And if we have some problems here, too much taxes or regulations, it puts pressure on us to clean up our act. But the interesting thing is, if all the imports of steel that we have, only 2% come from China. 16% come from our good friends north of us, Canada. And Canada will not be bashful. If they need to, they will put on tariffs. And I think that's interesting because some of our friends that we don't even talk about will punish. And of course, I'd like to think the American people are our friends too. And so why are we going to punish them? But not a lot of people think of tariffs as a tax, but it really literally is a tax. Because even if you don't write a check and say this is for a tax, what it does is it ends up pushing prices up, the imports or the cost of making stuff here at home. So and people say, yeah, but you have jobs. As if you don't protect these jobs, you're going to lose these jobs completely. And one thing they don't take into consideration is sometimes if you have a steel industry, and this happened several decades ago, and I lived in Pittsburgh at the time the steel industry was being diminished, but they weren't up on the technology. If technology comes along and makes steels cheaper, jobs are going to go down. So just imagine that, oh, we have less steel making jobs. It's sort of like feather bedding on the railroads. You know, they'd keep an extra person on the railroad that wasn't shoveling coal anymore because you couldn't fire them. So industries like that, they feather bed it and they keep people around, and they don't look at, well, maybe it's good that there are less people producing more. That means that energy and funding can go to something else. But it's all this mischief, and it's this assumption that government is smart, people are dumb, the market doesn't work, and if we didn't have these people to plan the market, the economic planners, everything would go to pot. Sometimes maybe that would be better.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a great point, Dr. Paul, you made that, you know, most of the steel comes from Canada, 16%. Yet look how it's sold to the American people. It's much easier to sell that we're going to beat China, because that's a much easier sell than Canada. Who's going to care about that? But China riles people up. And just to reiterate your point, we're the ones that pay this. Donald Trump does not have the authority to tax anybody in China. He could tax us, though, and he wants to keep taxing us. As a few weeks ago, he wants to raise gas taxes, too. So we're the ones that pay the price, but it's all wrapped in a deception to help it to sell better. And
Trump and other protectionists always use the figure of trade imbalances. We buy more stuff from them than they buy from us. And that's the wrong figure. They have to look at the balance of payments, because if we buy more stuff from China, maybe we're getting a good deal. Maybe we're exporting our inflation. Maybe it's because we have the reserve currency of the world. Maybe we have extra dollars, and we go and buy their stuff. But what do they do with the money? Does that mean the money just disappears and we suffered this loss of our money? No, we ended up getting the goods, which was a better deal than if we were making our own stuff. At the same time, the money comes back. The dollars have to be spent back here. So it's the balance of payments. And essentially, the balance of payments always have to be in balance. Otherwise, it would just come to an end. No, it isn't directly. You can't measure and say, oh, China, we buy $100 billion of stuff, and they're going to spend $100 billion here. I think the best way for people to think about this is we don't keep trade balances in the United States. What if we did have separate countries like we were essentially supposed to have, but we're one country, and so we don't think about it? But who would keep track of the balance of trade between New York and Texas, or Texas and California? Nobody even cares about that, because we know it goes back and forth, and if one state provided greater services and another state kept using it and they kept spending that money, that state, unless they produce and sell something, they go broke and they have to quit. So the market works and adjusts. But this whole idea, and Trump says it all the time, protections all the time, that the balance of trade, it has to be perfect. Well, balance of payment is what has to be in balance, and always is. But this whole thing that the fact that they sell us more stuff is a tremendous benefit to them, where I am convinced that the benefit comes to us because we print the money. We have talked the world into using the dollar as the reserve currency of the world, and we export our money and we get our stuff, and then we have a lot of money left over because we get cheaper products, and it just happens that we are the wealthiest country in the world, but we're undermining this because of our deficits and regulations and protectionism and all these things. So eventually, you know, it comes to an end, but there's a lot of myths about trade, and it's the one big factor is the confidence that people in Washington, in Congress or executive branch or planners, they know what's best. And I think, you know, it started even before Adam Smith, that they started talking about common sense in trade, and that things worked out. There was the invisible hand of the marketplace. They made these adjustments, but nobody has that confidence. Even the people who claim they're free traders, they're very much into managed trade through the WTO and NAFTA and these sorts of things.
Yes. You know, we always hear that China, oh, they're subsidizing well, that's their problem, not ours. I mean, they're hurting the Chinese people. And we're getting basically a gift with these quote unquote dumping and all the other excuses that they use. That's to our benefit. They shouldn't do it. But it's not right to turn around and say, oh, yeah, well, we're going to do the same to our people. We're going to hurt the American people in retaliation. It makes no sense. I mean, why does China keep buying American debt? It's foolish, but we can't stop other foolish nations. We got to just not be foolish ourselves. And unfortunately, that's not the road that we take, unfortunately.
You know, this argument's been going on a long time. It was there at the beginning of our country. There were the protectionists, and there were the others who believed in free trade. And this continues on, but we've had the people at times put on more protection. And if you look at the Depression, many people believe that the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill made the Depression much, much worse. Others will argue against it, but there's no way that it couldn't be significant and compounding our problems of the Depression. Of course, the Depression was really caused basically by the mischief of the Federal Reserve System, and it was compounded by bad trade policy. But that was one of the first things that was put on, I think, in 1930. And one of the first things that Roosevelt did by 1934, they knew these tariffs weren't helping anything. But it is something that people have resorted to because in the narrow sense, in the immediate thing, it looks like it's going to benefit, but they never look at the cost, which is distributed by a larger number of people. If one group of people or one business person has a benefit, the cost might be to dozens and dozens of other places where they're going to lose jobs. And people basically, the more protection you have, the less jobs there are because it undermines all the businesses. If you're depending on imports for jobs, and just say that you're in the business of distributing a foreign car or television or something, and all of a sudden you're not allowed to have imports. There are thousands, if not many hundreds of thousands of people who have jobs on the side, but they never get measured. It's always this one thing, and it's always this, you gotta really get annoyed with somebody. And there's a big thing on be annoyed with the Chinese, and because they're still a bunch of vicious communists over there. At the same time, they're buying and selling and investing around the world in a much wiser way than we're doing. They're not laissez-faire capitalists, but at least they're not doing what we do. The only way we invest is sending our troops around the world, spending money and wasting money and getting a bad reputation, where China ends up owning a lot and buying things and investing that money that we spent over there. So this whole idea that China is really the bad guy and that they're taking advantage of us, I think that's just an excuse. I think people are kidding themselves. If they can relieve themselves of their own guilt, that's what people do here on foreign policy. Not our fault, not our fault. It's always those other guys over there. It's their fault. It's Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. It's their fault, their fault. But they never will look to themselves and say, you know, maybe we contribute to this mess. And in the same way in trade, I think we should look more to what we're doing, because quite frankly, and you've already mentioned it, Chris, is if another country subsidizes their industry, it's a gift to us. You know, let them do it. It's a cost to them. Take advantage of it. If you could buy an item for 50% off, you have 50% left over. You get your item and you get the left over. Your standard of living goes up. It doesn't go down. It goes down if you say, oh, I don't want this advantage. They're giving us a discount, and we don't want that to happen. We want to pay full price or more here in this country. So it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. To finish, Dr. Paul, on my end, I came across our friend Peter Schiff. He said this morning that if Trump really wanted America to be more competitive, this is what he would do. He would slash regulations and massively reduce government spending, including entitlements. And doing so would free up resources so that we can invest in plants, equipment, worker training. I would add the military, too, into that to slash, but that would free up and help make America more competitive. Not a special interest group, you know, plundering us with tariffs. That's not the way to go. But they want their welfare state and their warfare state intact, and that's the way we're going these days.
You know, there was one time in history there was a major transition from a collectivist type of state into one with freer markets that worked with nonviolence. And that happened in the mid part of the 19th century. And that had to do with repealing of the Corn Laws. And this is a really interesting history. Back in 1815, they put on these strict tariffs, and this is in the British Empire. And these tariffs were terrible. And people were suffering. And there was a major debate going on there. Now, the leader of getting rid of the Corn Laws was Richard Cobden. They call them the Corn Laws, but they were tariffs on everything. And Richard Cobden orchestrated this, and he was sort of the agitator, and he was in the Parliament, but he was a spokesman for getting rid of these Corn Laws. Now, the Prime Minister at that time was Robert Peel, and he was not for free markets, and Cobden was influenced by Adam Smith. But Peel argued with him and didn't do it. But at the end, he more or less on the Parliament floor one time said, when Cobden gave this great speech when it was finally voted to repeal these laws, Peel just threw up his hands. I have no answers. And it was rather dramatic, and then he signed the bill. And this came in 1846. They wrote the law in 1815, 1846, so they had 30 years where they were really suffering. And it's interesting that in 1846 or so, they had the famine, the potato famine that was on. And that was related to protectionism too. So it was the disaster that they were having. And the reason why this is significant, it ushered in the age of the British Empire's most positive years. They became the free traders of the world, and they had the currency of the world. And this lasted for a long time until other things got in the way. But it was a dramatic change, and it ushered in the Industrial Revolution and so much. And it was more or less the time when sensible people were changing their mind of this persistent, determined protectionism and try to outdo it with other people. So I think it's a dramatic story. If the viewers have never read this, you ought to read the story about the repeal of the Corn Laws and Richard Cobden. But this whole thing, there's so many aspects of the trade and so much silliness that goes out there. I think it's so easy and so simple, especially for an individual like myself or anybody who accepts the principles of freedom of expression and reject any initiation of force and violence to bring about change. It's so simple. All you have to say is a person has the right to their life, they have a right to their fruits of their labor, and they have a right to spend their money. And if you had that, you spend your money any place you went, and this is the only form of pure democracy that I like. It's the way the consumer spends their money that dictates wages and dictates success, dictates profits, and the whole works. So, but it's the consumer, it's the person who works and has something, has the right to do the voting and spend the money. Which means then that if you get a better deal, overseas, take it. Because it's a benefit to you buying whatever you wanted. At the same time, it puts pressure on the people who aren't doing a good enough job, or maybe it explains that we shouldn't be doing it. What if you were having protection of bananas for the United States? They don't grow here. Well, we'll build big greenhouses. It's so stupid. What you want to do is allow the people who are capable of making it, and now that we do have a world economy, this is even better. This should be so magnificent. So the last thing in the world we need are trade wars. We need liberty, the simple explanation that it's your money, your life, spend the money the way you want. Believe me, it would solve a lot of our problem, and that is based on a principle, of course, on private property rights. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon. And Chris, thank you for being with us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Dr.
Very good. And thank you, everybody.